Hey, I'm Alex Thompson. I'm here with Senator Ron Wyden, talking about net neutrality and some of the other issues of the day. Thanks so much for taking the time, Senator.
Thanks for having me back, Alex.
And if you have any comments or questions for the Senator, please leave them in the comments. So, Senator, tomorrow we're going to see a vote on the FCC to repeal net neutrality rules. So just to start, can you explain what net neutrality is and why you feel it's so important?
I'm glad you asked that, because certainly telecommunications policy isn't something people bat around at the coffee shop or at the water cooler. Net neutrality means after you pay your internet access fee, you get to go where you want, when you want, and how you want. And all bits are created equal. This is the essence of openness and fairness and freedom for all. It's what makes the internet so important. For example, if you're using it to get information about healthcare or education, maybe you're looking for a job. And what people really need to understand is without net neutrality, companies can manipulate the marketplace to help choose winners and losers, and they can do that up until the time when consumers get fewer choices and pay higher prices.
So in your mind, what would be the nightmare scenario if net neutrality is repealed?
The nightmare scenario is there would be even less competition than there already is, and consumers, as I've indicated, would just get clobbered with fewer choices and higher prices. This is what the big cable companies have always wanted. The big cable companies are interested in making it possible for the people with the big wallets to get special deals. It's called paid prioritization, for example. And they can really shake up your life in a really bad way. I mean, they can determine, for example, the speed that you get access to content. They can control content in some respects. So I want people to understand that I think this is going to be a huge setback, given the fact that an open and free internet is, in my view, the biggest contribution to communications in decades and decades.
So do you see this as big cable companies versus internet companies, or is there also a distinction within internet companies? Are some big internet companies also with big cable companies?
Well, certainly the big people, the deep pockets, often align. But what you really find is that rural areas, small businesses, people who, for example, might have a new, innovation, it's going to be hard for them to come out of the starting gate. So yes, there is very much a kind of big interest versus little interest in this. And Mr. Pai, the head of the Federal Communications Commission, basically is talking about trickle-down telecommunications. He's basically saying if the big guys can go out and make more money, that's suddenly going to produce more broadband, say, in rural areas. Well, the evidence shows there was actually more investment when there were net neutrality rules that had real teeth. So that's one issue to look for. Also, you'll hear a lot about how Mr. Pai and others would like kind of a soft touch. That's what they say a lot. Basically, what they want to do is gut the strong rules that have been put in recently. At one point, the cable companies said, well, we like net neutrality, but it should be voluntary. And I said, my wife and I are older parents, we have 10-year-old twins, there's about as much chance that the cable companies will go along with voluntary net neutrality as there is for the Wyden twins to voluntarily limit the number of their desserts.
And, in terms of tomorrow's vote, how critical is tomorrow? Can it be undone? are we going to see, if a Democrat is in the White House in 4 years, can it be reversed, or is this really it?
No, this is far from it. Obviously, Mr. Pai is very well positioned for tomorrow. We understand that. But he still has got to go to court. The fact is that the courts have seen our evidence that we've assembled, the millions of people who've weighed in with a fair amount of sympathy. They feel we've made a good case, and we've done it by the book. It has been a painstaking kind of effort. So I happen to think that net neutrality is settled law. In other words, some people are saying, well, Mr. Pai might rule against you tomorrow, so what happens next? I mean, I've always said I'll talk about legislation in this area if you're talking about net neutrality rules with teeth. That's not what Mr. Pai and his allies want. In fact, they want something that is just the opposite of what I've described.
So if people want to get involved in this issue, if they're hearing you and they're saying, we want to do something about it, what can they do? I mean, obviously, a few years ago, you had a lot of comments on the FCC website. Can they still do that? Are there other things that they can do?
Certainly letting the FCC know always makes sense. I've always believed that political change doesn't start in government buildings in Washington, D.C. and a state capitol and then trickle down. Instead, it's bottoms up. It comes from the grassroots as millions of Americans weigh in. So I think it's important for people who are following this debate definitely to weigh in with the Federal Communications Commission, with the White House, and also with their members of Congress, because these issues are federal in nature.
And so we have a question in from Sam at the Wizard Beard 2 on Twitter, who just wants to know, do you think net neutrality will be repealed? There's the vote tomorrow, and then you also mentioned the lawsuit. So what is the next month or even longer?
I think Mr. Pai obviously is playing a very strong hand tomorrow. We understand where the votes are in the Federal Communications Commission, but we are looking at a variety of ways here in the Congress. We'll have more to say about this shortly in terms of stopping him. The court proceeding will certainly take some months, and I think it is just so important, given the fact that this issue is so important and so fluid, for folks who are following this to be weighing in now.
And we also have a question from Ray Sandoval, who wants to know, how much of net, quote-unquote, neutrality do we really have right now?
Well, as you know, and anybody who's following this, the big companies have been chipping away at this for some time, but we still have the foundations of equality and an open to all internet. What net neutrality would do is it would formally lock in to public policy that you could have companies manipulate the marketplace and be involved in picking winners and losers and raising prices for consumers and limiting choices. So there isn't any question that this person who was in touch is already concerned at how some of the big companies are chipping away at some of what I and others think is a completely free and open internet. But why we feel so strongly in terms of protecting net neutrality is that still ought to be the bedrock principle. And when I have town meetings, I just had my 80th town meeting at home. Nobody's ever done that many. And I did it because people have so many questions about issues like net neutrality and taxes and healthcare and surveillance and the like. And if you remember nothing else about this debate, just remember we're talking about protecting the essence of the internet, which is what we have today. You pay that internet, access fee. You get to go where you want, when you want, how you want. And everybody's treated the same. The most powerful people in the country and those of modest means who might, as I said, just get on 10 o'clock in the morning and hope that a job pops up at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. They have an opportunity to provide for themselves and their family.
And to follow up on that point, James P. Evans has also written in, and he wanted to ask you, for example, if that bedrock, let's say that the lawsuits don't work and that it is actually done away, can it be restored? Can we actually bring back and re-regulate?
Absolutely. But let's not speculate about losing. Let's focus on winning. And my sense is Mr. Pai, step by step, plays a strong hand this week. We have a sense of where he's counting his votes. He's got to go through the court process. We're looking at ways at the Congress to unravel him. If anybody wants to talk about legislation, well, I believe it's settled law. If they've got ideas for tough net neutrality rules that are enforceable, we'll talk about that. So I appreciate the fact that people who are in touch now as we discuss these issues want to know exactly what the implications of this are. This is far, far from over. And if you share my view that political change isn't going to really be driven by what happens in a government building, whether it's FCC or another government building, the people really have a chance to grab onto this and say, we get what this is about. It's about a free and open internet. It's about ensuring that somebody who's got a good idea has the same shot as the people who have the deep pockets. And it's about making sure that consumers don't get clobbered with higher prices for less service because the net neutrality rules go away and a company can manipulate the market.
And I'm curious, where do you think the President Trump is on this at all? I mean, have you got an indication that he's reviewed the policies or really know what Chairman Pai is doing?
What we know about this administration is very often they sort of make some noises about taking positions that are in favor of the typical person up against the powerful interests. But when it really comes down to making big decisions, like when the president said that he was going to take on high pharmaceutical prices, after he was done with that, after the campaign, he basically folded and went away. So my sense is that Mr. Pai didn't get this job by accident. Mr. Pai got it because he has been somebody who has been year after year after year been advocating what I call this trickle-down, communications, policy, where his theory is if, big guys can just make more money, even if there's more concentration, which so often harms consumers. He thinks that will somehow trickle down to people in, say, rural Oregon, and the evidence just doesn't show that's the case.
And I apologize if I mispronounced your name, Salim, but on Facebook wanted to take a little bit more of an international look at this, and that if the U.S. abolishes net neutrality, what happens to global internet activity to and from the U.S.? Does it affect it?
Certainly, what we know is people look to the United States as the pace setter. And it seems to me if the United States starts moving away from the fundamental architecture of the internet, that it's very likely to have dramatic, global implications. For example, a number of years ago, there was a very anti-internet bill that was being considered here in the Senate in the name of fighting piracy. And what it would have done would have changed the domain name system of the internet, the architecture of the internet. And I fought this with everything I had, and we were able to derail it. But one of the reasons that I did is that I thought, boy, if the United States starts meddling with the architecture of the internet, the domain name system, which is really like the phone book of the internet, I think we're going to have real problems around the world.
And, I mean, do you see, in terms of what India has been doing with the internet, and China obviously is a very much closed internet system, I mean, how do you think it would affect both of those countries if we adopt?
I think we ought to see a lesson there. The last thing we want to do is be a closed society like China. And I don't know of any major economic player that has moved faster to put in place repressive practices, practices that keep people from access to information. I don't know of any country that's moved faster and more aggressively to institute practices that limit access to information than China. That ought to be a role model for what not to do.
And we have another question from Matthew Joint, and a few other people have been really asking this. And what happens to people with a VPN if net neutrality is repealed?
Well, I think there are a lot of questions about all of those issues. Now, the big cable companies and the big communications players all say, don't expect any changes. You've probably seen their ads. We're not going to change content. We're not going to change speed. But I think that's an open question.
And I mean, do you believe them? Do you think they're lying when they promise that?
Based on their track record, what they've always tried to do is squeeze another few dollars out of the typical, person at the beginning. And then it goes up and up and up. And then we see this redistribution of political power where people at the top have access to even more information. I mean, my sense is that a big part of this almost is like promoting an information aristocracy, is if you have paid prioritization, all these big players cutting all these special deals, eventually those big players are going to have access to some kind of technology treasure trove, and people of modest means who not very long ago all they had was dial-up, they're going to be left behind.
And the critics would argue that for example, Netflix takes up a lot of broadband, and that if you have net neutrality rules, everyone in the United States is now subsidizing people with Netflix subscriptions. And what do you say to those critics?
Well, what I say is we all benefit from a system that is free and open. We all benefit as consumers with fair access. And I'm prepared to have a debate about those kinds of issues. What I will not debate is unraveling that principle that after you pay your internet access fee, everybody's treated the same.
And we have another question from Carrie Bellion on Facebook, who I guess feels a little bit disillusioned in terms of what they can do. Because the question was, what do we do when the entire Congress is owned lock, stock, and barrel? And why are more Democrats even not speaking about this in Congress? It feels that, according to this question, they feel like even the Democrats aren't listening.
That question was Cory, right?
Yes, Cory.
I'm so glad that question was asked, because I want to come back to this example. A few years ago, all of the big commercial interests were lined up. You had Hollywood, the Chamber of Commerce, you had a bunch of unions. All of the money was lined up saying we've got to fight piracy. And, people selling fake sneakers or Viagra or whatever online. And they said they wanted to do it by basically changing the architecture of the internet. Would have done an enormous amount of damage to it. And there were more than 40 senators that were sponsoring the bill, scores of members of the House of Representatives, and I put a hold on the bill. And everybody said, oh, poor Ron Wyden, he has no chance. Some people would say, well, he's from Oregon, and we all know what Oregon's like. I'm proud to be from Oregon. And nobody thought we had a chance. And 4 days before the Senate scheduled a vote on whether to lift my hold, 15 million Americans called and they texted and they sent tweets and they went to see their member of Congress. And a day and a half later, a very unhappy congressional leadership called me and said, you won. And I was the only person who put a hold on it. And that's what galvanized this debate. So I understand why Cory's worried. I mean, we had this bill where, basically the companies can, give out your browsing history and all kinds of things. I assume we're going to talk a little about surveillance here. So I understand why people are concerned about whether the grassroots, people who are listening to this program, can beat big cable. But we've done it before. We did it with these PIPA-SOPA bills, these horribly anti-internet bills, when we had a lot less support and a lot less visibility when we started than we do today. I mean, we've had extraordinary millions of people getting involved in this, issue. And it's going to take more time to try to lay it out. As I said, the first thing we talked about is what is net neutrality? Because people need to know that it is that essence of fair and open treatment right after you pay your internet access fee that is the unifying, concept. And you've asked several questions. Are the big companies chipping away at it? Yes. Are there issues with respect to big data users? Absolutely. But we shouldn't lock in to public law a dangerous principle like unraveling net neutrality.
Well, and you just gave me the perfect transition to surveillance. So right now, Congress is debating the reauthorization of a lot of the surveillance laws that were passed right in the aftermath of 9/11. And what is at stake over the next month? What's going to happen? And what are you fighting for and why?
Well, there are at least three big issues, coming up. One is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. We can talk about that. Second is border searches, because I don't believe the Constitution ought to stop at the border, and we're seeing people having to hand over their cell phones and the like. And third, a really ominous judgment is the Justice Department has talked about bringing back what they call responsible encryption, which would be, for people paying attention to this program, essentially meaning that the government would require companies to build backdoors into their products. And just so people who are following this understand the implications, I think this is wrong from a security standpoint. I think we're more safe with strong encryption. I think it's obviously a mistake from a liberty standpoint with people's personal information being more easily accessed. And I think it's a horrible step economically, because a lot of high-skill, high-wage jobs depends on those companies. I want everybody who's following this program to know that if there is an effort to require companies to build backdoors into their products and weaken strong encryption, I will shut down the Senate over that issue. I will filibuster that bill because I think it is so extraordinarily bad for our country. So, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is really, again, getting back to the principles here, it makes sense to target serious foreign threats. I'm for that. I just don't want an end run on the Constitution as it relates to Americans who get caught up in those searches. So, Section 702, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance, encryption, and then I'm increasingly concerned. We have a bipartisan bill with Senator Rand Paul. I think this idea that somehow your constitutional rights stop at the border is a big mistake, and I think it relates, you were talking about court suits and the like. One of the encouraging things, you see it in Judge Sotomayor's comments, you also see it in the Chief Justice's comments, John Roberts, is a growing recognition that digital is different. You have your whole life wrapped up in a smartphone. And the court has even said, if somebody's arrested, you don't get to automatically search their smartphone without a warrant.
Fantastic. And I also wanted to ask, in terms of also news of the day, we obviously saw that the Democrats won a Senate seat in Alabama where Donald Trump won just 13 months ago by 28 points, and a Democrat won in that state. Should Democrats, obviously there were rare circumstances in this case where the Republican nominee had a lot of baggage, but do you think that that this is a one-off, or do you think that this pretends something deeper? And what can Democrats
before
think?
one starts the analyses, I think this is just wonderful news for people who want good and caring government. I'm the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee. We have authority over the CHIP program, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Doug Jones talked about one program last night, just one. It was the Children's Health Insurance Program. And if I had had my way, this would have been passed by the Senate and signed into law a long time ago, because we've got millions of families, that are walking on an economic tightrope because the Congress won't make a decision on the children's health insurance bill. I mean, you say to yourself, what could possibly be partisan about children's health? But the far right has somehow made it, partisan. They want to do everything else. They want to give handouts to multinational corporations before they'll do this. And I was so pleased that last night, Doug Jones had a chance to talk about a lot of things, but he went right away to the Children's Health Insurance Program. These are families, and some of them go back and forth between the Children's Health Insurance Program and the Medicaid program, depending on if a family member's out of work. But these are families that walk an economic tightrope every day, balancing their food costs against their fuel costs, and the fuel costs against housing bills. And to know we're going to have a new United States Senator from the state of Alabama who had a chance to talk about any set of issues he was interested in talking about last night, when millions of people were like me, staying up and trying to see what was going to happen. What did he talk about? Children's health insurance. And I just turned out the lights, went to bed, and I said, I'm a happy guy. That's the kind of person I want in the United States Senate.
So Republican Senator Cory Gardner, he issued a call last night after the Democrat won and said that because Alabama supports tax reform, that Doug Jones should vote to support tax reform. Do you think that he will?
Well, I think Doug Jones, I'll let him speak for himself, but I followed his comments during the campaign. Doug Jones kept talking about the middle class. Look, the middle class drives 70% of the economic activity in our country. Those are the folks, who buy cars and remodel houses and send kids to child care. That's where the big economic multiplier is. Middle class just gets clobbered, in this bill. It also includes gutting the Affordable Care Act. It's really a dagger right into the heart of the Affordable Care Act. So 10% increase in premiums, 13 million people lose their coverage. So I followed what Doug Jones said in the campaign, and he basically said economic security issues are the key for me. I'm going to be sensitive to what the people of Alabama are talking about, and they told me that health care costs and jobs and keeping jobs in the United States, this tax bill that we're going to have a conference committee on here today, Wednesday, makes it more attractive to do business outside the United States because of something called territorial taxation. So I was really pleased, again, to see someone talking in such a common sense, connect with the middle class kind of way as Doug Jones did both last night in his campaign.
We have another question from Facebook from Kevin Lipp, and I'm actually going to go back just real quick to net neutrality, just because he wants to know, what happens to Bitcoin or even just the blockchain technology that undermine that is the platform for Bitcoin.
This is a little bit different, and obviously there are a whole host of cryptocurrency kinds of issues to examine. Tell them to be in touch with our office, and we'll go into a little more detail. But
you hear that, Kevin?
There are different issues, and for example, I'll give you an example. There are a lot of regulatory questions, even with respect to how you deal with cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin was essentially the first, and we're starting to ask some of them, but it's a different issue than net neutrality.
Gotcha. And you said just last week, going back to kind of politics of the day, you said last week that you feel like the president should resign. and that he obviously doesn't seem like he is going to do that. So I wanted to ask that the next step. So let's say that if the House tomorrow decided to vote on articles of impeachment and pass them, and it came to the Senate, would you vote to impeach the president?
Well, let's step back a little bit so you'll get a sense of what I said, because I think there was a little bit of context, to it. President's indicated he isn't going to resign, and so I wanted people to know: A, I believe the women with respect to, and there were some others who came forward, again yesterday. And I think when you are talking about this level of harassment and this number, of people, if the president, won't take personal responsibility for his conduct, you bet you ought to have hearings, and those ought to begin, immediately. Nobody is above the law, and I think that's the appropriate step. And I note the House vote, last week, I think seemed to indicate that as well. And I think the other part about this relates to a topic I think you're interested in touching on as well, and that's Russia. And I want people who are following this program to know that anybody who just sits back and says, well, Donald Trump can do what he wants with respect to Bob Mueller, ought to understand that's going to trigger a constitutional crisis. I believe that every Democrat and every Republican in the Congress today, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, should say right now that if Donald Trump interferes with Bob Mueller's work, that's going to trigger a constitutional crisis with all the implications that you just were asking about.
Well, and Bob, the Senate investigation on Russia, you are on the Intelligence Committee.
I still am.
You still are. And, over the last several months, there have been fewer and fewer public hearings. Chairman Richard Burr has not had many public hearings, and he said just yesterday that he doesn't plan or doesn't see a reason for many more public hearings. Do you think he's wrong?
I have told the chairman, Richard Burr, and the ranking Democrat, Mark Warner, that I think the public's got a right to know here. And in the original agreement that was laid out at the beginning of this Congress, I put public hearings right at the center. There are two pieces that I think are critical: the public hearings and what I call the follow the money issues. I have put holds on several appointees with respect to the Trump administration who have not shown any indication in terms of helping us get access to documents, particularly even while I'm on the Intelligence Committee. The Finance Committee has got very good, investigators. We can't even get access to unclassified documents, documents that aren't classified. So I think there are dots to be connected here. Dot one, the president said, his family said in 2009 that much of their portfolio consisted of Russian money. Then over here, we know that he hasn't put out his tax returns, which ought to, again, be a wake-up call. First time in 40 years. Then over here, we read in the New York Times that many of his businesses, hundreds, apparently, are pass-through businesses that would benefit from the tax bill. So follow the money issues and public hearings have been my two priorities with respect to this Russian investigation. And one last point, there has been discussion about setting some sort of arbitrary date for finishing the Intelligence Committee's work. I strongly oppose that as well. You follow the evidence and you don't wrap up until you've done that.
And, we started this conversation on net neutrality, so I think it's pretty fitting that we end it there. And, what can Americans do just in the next 24 hours to make sure that their voices are heard?
They ought to weigh in with the Federal Communications Commission. We've had links on our website and can make that information available to folks. Call their senators and House members. Participate in things in the community. There are lots of rallies and marches and folks all over the country who are speaking out. Join it, because that's going to make a difference, not just in terms of what happens tomorrow, because we know Mr. Pai is playing a strong hand tomorrow. But if you share my view that political change doesn't get made in a government building and then trickle down, but it's bottoms up, that's why people ought to participate right now, and I appreciate you wrapping up the discussion this way.
Great. And that's all the time we have. Senator Wyden, thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks to everyone at home tuning in. Thanks for your great questions, and follow Vice News and vicenews.com for more updates.